Oh,
So you know
all
it.
right. Now we got to be good.
Everybody knows anything bad.
No profanity. Okay.
Tell me if my hair juts out too much.
No, your hair looks good. No, Zoom
Yeah.
likes to notify everyone when it starts recording so that there's no secret recordings. You know how.
Where's everyone? Okay.
You know. Okay, so anyway, what Breezy and I want to do, we have like we developed a whole list of interview questions, so it's not like off the cuff, but we're just going to start by saying what is today's date and year, and yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
So what's today's date and the year?
Is it September 5th?
I don't know.
oh.
It's September 6th.
Excuse me while I go.
It's September 6th,
Oh.
2020.
Yeah, so Sunday.
Oh, right, because tomorrow is Emily's anniversary, September 7th.
Don't
Oh,
forget.
very good,
Okay.
very good. And it's also Labor Day. Well, no, yeah, tomorrow's Labor Day.
Yes.
Yeah, so today is September 6th, 2020, and here we go. So, and this is Breezy.
Mom, grandmother,
And
dad.
Daddad. Very good. And Liv is off to the side somewhere. Maybe he'll
And
make it.
who are you?
So we are sisters.
We are sisters. You're our grandparents.
The
Very
COVID
good.
sisters.
We're sisters. And Breezy is here from Muhlenberg during quarantine because these days we're all dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, and
Yeah.
Breezy doesn't.
Remote school from Philadelphia.
Yeah, so that's why we're not in person. But yeah, this video is meant to serve as posterity of the time, but also be viewed by other people. Generally, like, you know, me and Breezy could have our grandchildren watch this, and it'll be like a piece of the time.
Can we watch it too at that time?
Yes,
Posterity sounds scary.
I know. Well, I think the scariest thing that we're all living through is right now. So, as you know, yeah, anything else will be a walk in the park. But okay, so Breezy and I have the full.
First question. What are your full names?
My full names?
Yeah.
Right. Remember, we know these, but we're recording it for posterity.
Yeah.
Rosalind, Rosen, COVID.
And
Bernard COVID. No middle initial.
very good. And when are your birthdays? And where were you born? And where did you grow up?
My birthday is Columbus Day, if it ever exists by the time you record this. And October 12th, 1927 in Brooklyn, New York. And I think it was called Brooklyn Women's Hospital.
Okay.
And Daddad.
That's it?
And now Daddad, your answer.
Yes. I was born in New York, actually 104th Street and Park Avenue. Not the Park Avenue we know.
Or used to know.
But my parents moved to Brooklyn and I went with them. So I guess I was born and raised pretty much in Brooklyn. And then we moved elsewhere, moved back to the Bronx. And I was raised in the Bronx in my latter young years. And I was born on September 10th, 1924.
Coming up. Very good. Very good.
Oh, I don't know where my parents lived when I was born. They may have lived in Bensonhurst or East New York. I'm not sure.
Okay.
My grandparents lived in East New York.
Got it. And what are your Hebrew names?
But very funny. Rivalea.
Those are
Right.
Hebrew names. That's her Hebrew name?
She said, what are our Hebrew
The
names?
Hebrew name is
We
Rivalea.
used to laugh because my cousin Beverly's name was Bunsalea.
Bot. Who's the
she was-
bot?
There is no bot.
You had to have a mother.
I don't call myself that way. My Hebrew name is Rivalea. Rivalea.
Rivalea. And what's Daddad's?
And mine is Baruch Ben Shmarya. My father's name was Samuel.
My
Right.
mother's name was Sarah, but in English, Charlotte.
Okay, well, this is good because the next question was to say what were the names of your parents, grandparents, and siblings, and where were they born?
My mother was born, I believe, in 1904 in Russia, I guess. Maybe Belarus, not sure, Belarus. And they came to this country in about 1909 or thereabouts. Nothing is for sure.
Mhm.
That was a mistake I made. I never found out things for sure. And my dad was born, I don't know her birthday actually, her birth date.
Where?
I'm not sure of his birth date, but he was born in 1900 and in Poland in a small town called, I don't know if it's small or big, Kutno, Kutno. And my mother came through Ellis Island. My father first was in Germany, then he went to Mexico, and from Mexico he came to this country.
Through Ellis Island.
I don't know if it was.
Or you don't know for sure, but you know your
I don't
mother.
know if you come from Mexico if you go through Ellis Island, or there might have, I'm not
You
sure about
cross the
that.
border.
Oh, right. If you're coming from Mexico, you're probably not right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. And Uncle Maurice, and where was
Uncle
you
Maurice
already said your parents' names. Charlotte, I think you said.
My mother was Sarah, and Charlotte, but they called her Sarah, and for her Hebrew name. My dad was Bernard.
Who Breezy was named after.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's same name as my husband, so.
Right. That's
Yeah.
a coincidence.
Otto,
Very good.
that cheese
And
grandpa something.
And then Uncle Maurice was also born in the same hospital.
Uncle Maurice was born, no, I don't know where he was born.
Okay.
Well, you were born.
Nobody told me. I was 5 years older than Uncle Maurice. And his name was, they didn't want to call him Morris because there were other Morrises in the family.
Who's that?
So my mother called him Maurice.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know his Hebrew name.
That's okay.
Daddad.
Probably Moshe.
Daddad's Hebrew name was Baruch, I guess.
Wait, hold on. Dad
Oh,
can answer
no.
for himself, right?
Yes.
Right. Okay, we want to know what,
So the names of your parents and grandparents and siblings and where they were born.
okay. My father was Samuel Covet. My mother was Gussie Covet. Also had a name at one point of Golda, but one of those two, but it's Gussie. My father was born in Russia, Poland, in a large town called Zamość, Zamosc, which is it has an interesting story of itself, the story of the town. I think he was born in 1885 or something like that. My mother was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire town of Drohobych, it's called. You know, all the little strange names. And let's see, what else do you want to know about my mother? Yeah.
And then Aunt Jeanette. Was Aunt Jeanette born in the same hospital as you?
Aunt Jeanette, I'm not sure where she was born. Probably
He was older.
in the same hospital.
Okay.
Do you know who each of you were named after?
I can't hear that.
Do you know who you were named after?
Me, okay.
I
I was named after, oh, okay.
I don't know who I was named after. Nobody told me. And I must say at the beginning of all these questions, my deep regret is that I never questioned my parents more about our family history.
It's, yeah, Breezy and I were similarly speaking about that we're doing that as much as we can now because we also regret that we didn't do this earlier.
Right.
Okay. But we're doing it now. Let's look at
Yeah.
it that way. Who's turn is it?
Who are you named
Yeah, who
after?
were you named
Daddad.
for?
All right. What's my next?
Who are you named for?
I'm named for my father's father, grandfather, whose name was Bernard, and it was Bernard Kovic. Although in Poland at the time, the name apparently was spelled or sounded like Chowet, Hovet, in the guttural K sound, which has an interesting story in itself, as you know.
Mm.
Oh, and our family name was different there too. My mother's last name was Wiener, but I have heard that the family was really Vorona,
Odessa.
Vorona in Odessa. Is Belarus in Odessa?
I don't think so.
Oh, then,
Odessa's a town.
oh, then they were from Odessa. And because my aunt, who was an opera singer during her professional time, was called Anna Vorona. And then we heard, and later on in somebody's funeral, that the Verona originally came from Verona, Italy.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, I think of
The
like,
fingers.
I think of Romeo and Juliet.
Right.
Okay, well, that's interesting. And then Daddad, for the purpose of this video, pretend that Breezy and I don't know the history of the last name Kovic. So in summary, what you were saying, oh, you know the history of that, give your own summation of the history of the name.
Spelling of Aovit.
Right.
I think, as I mentioned to you, my theory is, and I think it's pretty close, that when they came to Ellis Island and were interviewed by a customs official, he interpreted their saying Hobbit, came closer to him, so because he didn't get the CH ever. And so it was COVID at that point, because what it sounded like to this official. Therefore, we had that name, but we have relatives who are also COVID, but they spell their name Coved. These are in Canada. I'm talking about.
I didn't know that. Okay.
COVD is like the virus.
Yeah, that's even closer.
Yeah.
They're even more virus-like than us.
Yeah, more. Yeah.
And what else could I tell you?
And what is the translation of the word Choved or anglicized
Well,
COVID?
the Hebrew word kovet means honor. So my name, which is Baruch, which means blessed,
Oh my
it's
God.
blessed honor.
Who could compete with that?
Very nice. Very nice. Okay, good.
So my nickname is Bern, which sounds very much like Bernard, but only my mother would call me, and when she did, she would call me Bernie. So nobody ever called me Bernie but my mother occasionally. And
I would never call him Bernie. I hate that name.
Bernie.
My mother called my father Bernard,
Bernard.
so I called him Bern. From the very-
Yeah, to make it different.
That makes sense. Okay, the next question is, how did your parents make a living?
Me first.
Yeah.
My father, he always knew how to sew. And so I think he sewed in Germany, I'm not sure. But when he came to this country, his brother-in-law, his sister and brother-in-law already lived here, and they had a very lovely shop and also involved with tailoring women's clothes. But my father owned cleaning store. And that's the way I knew him until he changed. Then he became what they called a fitter in men's clothes in a men's shop. Very nice men's clothing stores. But he sewed. That was his, and he sewed so well that he used to sew things for me, make some clothing, dresses, costumes, all sorts of things. We had a sewing machine in our kitchen.
Never made anything for me, but he made up for it.
And your mom was a homemaker?
My mother, no, she was actually a bookkeeper.
Oh, very good.
Yeah, she went to school. She was very good at math. And that's what she did when she married my father. And of course, once people married in those days, they didn't really work. So she became a homemaker.
Got it. And Dad, how did your parents, what was their career?
My father was a tailor, and apparently a very good one, because when he came to America, he came with my uncle, his brother, and at one point they went to work as tailors for a very fancy women's clothing store, clothing factory called Belciano's, which made a very top scale line of clothing. And he was, at one point, he became assistant foreman. My uncle was the foreman in this company, which is a very well liked, very well known outfit called Belciano, an old Jewish name that.
I thought it was
someone-
Belsey.
Yes, the name was Belsey because the owner was a man named Dave Belsey, but the company was named as Belciano, which
Okay.
rings a bell even today.
Yeah, with the Belciano. Bell.
Oh, and my father also used to make clothing for my mother and for Roz, and I don't know, maybe somebody else. Beautiful stuff.
Very nice.
Well, they made it in the factory. He didn't.
Yeah, they had access to the
Personal
machinery in the factory, but they also had sewing machine. What else can I tell you? And my mother always made a point of saying that she completed the gymnasium, but it means high school in the old country, and that was a very important thing for a Jewish person to do, particularly a woman. I'm not sure she had any skills other than maybe some sewing, but I'm not sure. However, when they came to America, my mother and a couple of sisters and my grandmother came together on the ship, and they were listed on the manifest as seamstresses.
Oh.
So that, I guess they had to give a profession of some kind. And that's what okay, what's my next?
My mother came with her sister, and the story is that, you have to be examined before you are allowed out into
Right.
civilization. I think Auntie Anna, her younger sister, had some sort of eye problem. And for a while, they weren't sure if she would be allowed. But
Wow.
luckily, it got better. And of course, she was there. And then the rest of my mother's siblings were born in this country.
Okay. Do you happen, aside from grandmother's stories, Dad, do you know any stories that you've heard of what it was like for your family coming to the United States, aside from that they were labeled seamstress? Do you happen to know anything of the transition, like what grandmother said?
I'm not sure I understood all of that.
Well, aside from, do you happen to know any other kind of anecdotes about what the journey was like from Europe to the United States, other than that that they had the label seamstress? Do you anecdotally?
Well, there was my grandmother and these three young girls, young sisters. And I'm not sure what, they probably called my grandmother a seamstress too, but it was, I'm sure, a very trying voyage for them, because at the time it would take at least a couple of weeks at sea, and they would come, I guess, by steerage, which
Right.
means you're in a group, a large group. And
At the bottom.
at the bottom of the group, bottom of the ship. But occasionally they would go up on deck.
I don't
However,
know any stories about
Okay.
that.
I think the year they came here, I believe at Ellis Island, probably around 1912 or 1915, somewhere in there.
Right.
I used to know the name of the ship, but I can't recall at this second.
Rotterdam?
Yeah, the Rotterdam. Thank you, Jim. The Rotterdam.
Very nice.
And that was it.
Very good.
But
Okay.
his mother maintained an accent, so she came here as a young woman. My mother came as a child, so she never developed. She spoke as everybody else.
Okay.
Mhm.
Dad, are you going to do it? Should we
I'm
we
going to
pause?
get a picture of
He wants to
mother.
get a picture of
Oh,
his
very
mother.
nice.
Okay.
Very nice.
Very nice.
We'll pause for
Yeah.
a moment.
And my mother's
Intro.
siblings. You want to know about my mother's siblings?
Okay.
Yeah, whatever you
My
have.
grandparents had 5 children, and I was the oldest grandchild, so I was revered in every way. And my mother's sisters were Anna, who was a couple of years younger, a year and a half, and Yvette, who was about 10 years younger. In between were Samuel and Morris. So she had three girls and 2 boys.
Very good.
They lived in a house, their own house. And that's where I guess we lived for a while, but then we moved around the corner.
And Daddad has a
I'm going
picture.
to show you the picture of my mother at about age 19 or something like that.
That's how old I am.
And in the original frame.
Very nice. I remember seeing
Can
that.
you see it okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. That's an
Nice.
awesome picture to
By
have.
the way, little secret here. At any time people would take pictures, they had a book which showed that you were a learned person. Now these books will always show up in these antique pictures of different people.
That's interesting. I didn't know
If
that.
they pose with a book.
Oh.
Okay, see the book?
Very good.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Very good.
Do I look like her or does she look like me?
I don't know. It's hard to say. I don't know. I mean, maybe, but it's hard to say.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, okay, good. I'll leave her here behind us.
I mean, I could see that you're definitely like a.
You're related.
Yeah, but it's hard to say.
It's
Because
sort of like me and Mal.
yeah.
That.
It's like, I know you're related from looking at the picture, but like, I wouldn't say that
I
like, oh
think
my
you
God.
resembled your father a little bit, but not
Yeah.
your mother.
I look like my father more every day.
He was the handsomest of the group.
That's obvious.
Okay, going off the
I'll
theme
be back.
Oh, he's getting pictures.
Oh,
We
wait.
were not prepared with pictures.
Okay.
That's okay.
Next question.
Are you having fun?
I am. I'd love to talk.
Important question.
And so how far can I go with my responses?
As
As far
you
as, yeah,
want.
there's,
What's your next question?
so the next question is, where did you go to all of your schools from, you know, high school all the way up? And what was your
What was your best school subject?
Well, we didn't get to that yet, but when I was little, my mother complained when she was pregnant with me. She was ready to jump off the roof because she had the worst nausea in the world, and she was going out of her mind. Only they obviously convinced her not to jump. And I was born, and I was almost 9 pounds,
Whoa.
and I was a chubby baby. And
Oh,
the doctor called me the chubbiest baby in Brooklyn. And
Where does Dad keep
He's
going?
getting all the pictures.
I was very, what's the word? I did everything very early.
Oh, you were
I
advanced.
walked very early. I talked very early. You know, I was like, great. So when I was a little baby, about 9 months old or so, my grandmother, who was a fabulous cook, my grandparents had a farm in Parksville, New York, way up in the country. It was
Cool.
like a boarding house in those
Boarding house.
days. And she cooked, and she had people who came there. And the boys did farm jobs, tractors, horses, and so forth. And that's where I learned to walk at 9 months.
Oh,
The
wow.
first person I walked to was my Uncle Mo.
Wait, hold it up more.
Higher, higher, higher.
There you go. That's grandmother.
Well, grandmother was a chubby baby.
Yeah, that's a nice little fat face.
You just want to squeeze your teeth.
I was.
Very good. Very good.
You know, obviously, it
Like the
didn't-
moon coming up over the
it
mountain.
didn't last. It's funny, you know, they all thought I was, but since I was the youngest, the oldest grandchild, and no other grandchildren, they really showered me with,
That's
Right.
nice.
I mean, I had a fabulous babyhood,
That's nice.
and I had a lot of love. It was wonderful.
That's important.
Dada, do you know how you were as a baby?
As a baby,
Yeah.
I was an adorable baby. And my mother actually in a picture, in the back of the picture, one picture he took of me said, this is the best baby you can possibly have.
Wow.
And I believed her, you know.
Very good. Well, the question before was, what were the names of the schools that you've attended from, you know, earliest school all the way up to graduate school? You don't have to go into every story because there's going to be more questions later, but just what were your schools?
I
And
had
what's your favorite-
one little anecdote before we get to the school.
Okay.
When I was a kid, like about 7 or 8, I attended Hebrew school, Cheder, it's called in Hebrew. And I became the star of the Cheder, learning, you know, the different, not only ABCs, I learned to read and write and sing,
That's good.
usually liturgical stuff from the services Saturday. And I became the model, and the rabbi who was the teacher would use me to show new people coming in to see whether they want to bring their son in to be bar mitzvahed. There were no girls at the time, bar mitzvahed. Anyway, my voice was good, and I really, really sang out the songs as they should have been sung. So that's why he chose me to demonstrate.
That's
However, came my bar mitzvah time at 13, and I was ready to do all of the whole the service by me at the dais for the people in the temple. And I get up there, and everybody's looking at me, and you know they expect me to come out. And I opened my mouth and I started to sing, and my voice broke. Puberty strikes hard. My voice broke, and I couldn't get a word. I was like, and here I was, you know, I would, hey, da 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 da, or Baruch Hashem. You know, I was ready to really let him have it. And I could have done the most difficult and longest Haftorahs, but in my luck, the Haftorah I got, which was called Rani Akara for the first 2 words, is the shortest, simplest one that you can imagine. And that's what I had to talk through because I couldn't sing. And I'm looking at me, and all the nice older looking gentlemen in the shul were looking at me, expecting that great, you know, demonstration, great performance. Didn't happen. And that was a momentous part in my life. Until,
That's funny. Oh no.
so let's see, what did I do? Oh, I went to
Cool.
junior high, public school. I used to perform in junior high in different plays and stuff. In fact, my little book of you know, the autograph book from various teachers would say, dear maestro, because I was in some kind of leading role in there.
They would call you
They
Maestro.
said, we remember your performance, and I know you can be great for the rest of your life, things like that. But anyway, I
You
went
should
on
have
to,
saved the book.
I do have something like
I never saw that.
Neither have I lately. But what was I going to say? Oh, so then I went to an all-boys school called DeWitt Clinton. We lived in the Bronx, I should mention that. And I was a great devotee of the Bronx Zoo. I used to go there whenever I possibly could.
Very nice.
Enjoyed it. And so what can I tell you? What was I about to tell you?
I have no idea.
Oh, when I went to, I think it was public school, I suppose, like in my 8th or 9th, 10th grade, whatever. The teacher was so enamored of me. I was majoring mainly in science at the time, and he helped me a lot. In fact, made me his pet. And he arranged for me to go to a special part of Bronx Zoo because his had an interesting last name. His name was Freud. He had a little mustache,
Oh,
and he was a great guy and very interesting.
He analyzed you.
And he liked me. So he arranged for me to go to this special area in the Bronx Zoo on a different floor where they did the preparation of exhibits and things that special preparation for the animals. And I got all kinds of great stuff out there, which strengthened my interest in nature and natural life. Then on to high school, which was all boys school in the Bronx called DeWitt Clinton, named after the president, DeWitt Clinton, which is there today and still is boys school. And there at that time, I actually majored or excelled in tennis and kept playing as much tennis as I possibly could. In fact, every year when we go to the country, we happened to be next to a country club that had a tennis court, and a friend of my aunt's was a friend of several lady tennis stars. And I was able to play, would you believe, a kid of, what was I, 14, maybe 15, playing with these great names, one of which was a name called Louise Brough, Brough, who was a champion women player in whatever that was. And my interest in tennis persisted until my back gave out at about age 40 something, 50 maybe, and that stopped my tennis career. But I did, in tennis, I excelled enough to play. There was a New York City-wide Parks Department tournament, and I came in second. I lost to a very good player, and the day was very windy and sort of half rainy, and I couldn't get onto my game, but he was awfully good. And so that was one of my distinctive things. Then I joined a group at a small park in the Bronx called Poe Park, after the real Edgar Allan Poe. And we played tennis there all the time, as much time as we could get away for. And that was interesting and helped me develop my tennis skills.
very nice.
Other than that, what else can I tell you?
And then college and graduate school.
I say again.
Where did you go to college and graduate school?
Okay, we went to Brooklyn College. I went to Brooklyn College, and the outstanding event there was my meeting Mother in a.
Oh, wait, I haven't even gone through my
Oh no,
childhood.
I'll let you do
Oh,
it.
he's already got me engaged.
I'll get married soon.
Yeah, you don't have to worry right now of covering it. You can just give because there's more questions that will bring up the same.
Okay, I asked. Okay,
All right. Well,
So wait, so you went to Brooklyn College and then other school after Brooklyn College?
and I took every
in
possible.
between, he was in the Army.
Right.
Well, I started college and was there 6 weeks, and it became obvious that I would be called into the Army, so I went into the Army.
Got it.
And that I'll tell you about that experience a little later. But what was I going to say?
You didn't go to Iowa?
Oh,
And then he went back
then
after the Army.
immediately on the same day we got married, on February 5th, 1950, at the Grand Concourse Hotel, which was a fabulous marble marriage hall or something like that.
Mhm.
And we got on a Pullman train and drove and rode out to Iowa in a blizzard of snowstorm because it was February 5th at the time.
Right.
And that's how we went to Iowa. That was in Iowa. I was at the Creative Writers Workshop, and I started to say took every possible course of English writing that there was at Brooklyn, and
So it was a master's, like a graduate program in Iowa, or like
graduate program there. And Mother also attended that
Well, I'll
graduate.
explain that.
okay.
I'm going to say, I forgot what I was going to say.
All right, so we can stop there.
Oh, you can start this.
Grandmother, what were your schools?
Go back.
It took my whole childhood.
Oh, grandmother.
I loved, I started school. I don't remember liking kindergarten. I don't know why, but it was just not something that I have this love for. As soon as I got to first grade, I fell in love with school. I loved it. I just loved it. And it was like the most exciting thing in my life. And of course, we went in the morning, came home for lunch, and then we would go back again. I lived a block or two away from school. And and my mother, of course, she was very demanding in the sense that she always expected me to be perfect. That's another story.
95.
Like if I would, in general, like if I would get a 95, she'd say, why didn't you get 100? And I would cry when I got 95 because that was so terrible. And then in second grade, I'll tell you my funny story where I was a very good child. You know, I did everything right, but for some reason or other, the teacher had told us to do something, and I came back from lunch and I didn't have it done. And so whoever didn't do that, go to the back of the room. And why didn't you do it? And why didn't you do it? And why didn't you do it? And I said, well, so-and-so said we didn't have to do it. And she said, if so-and-so told you to jump off the Empire State Building, would you do that too? So that's my story of second grade. Miss May.
A classic.
She was hard, she was mean. Anyway, I was in second grade and it was Halloween and we were supposed to learn some Halloween poems. And Auntie Anna, who was an opera singer at the time, not married, or maybe she was married, I don't know. But she taught me this poem about 7 little ghosts,
Louder.
7 little goblins, 7 little ghosts. And I came to school and I said it the way she told me to say it. And the teacher said, oh, that sounds so good. So when we had auditorium once a week, it was called assembly. I went up in front of the assembly and I recited my poem. And they all looked at me. And all of a sudden, before I knew it, I was called into the principal's office and he said, we're having an operetta that I wrote with Miss Boyer, who was the dramatics teacher, he said, and we're going to give you a part in the play. You're going to be Peggy, and you are going to be the little girl who comes with her brother to the toy shop and wants to buy a doll. And all of a sudden, you know, I mean, it was very exciting. So we had to get my costume. My father made my pantaloons because in those days they had, you know, we were old school.
They know pantaloons.
And I was the youngest one. I mean, all the other kids were like 7th grade, 6th grade, and I was this little child.
Right.
I was like, and my brother, Kenneth Blackman, he was like 6th or 7th grade, but he wasn't very tall. And I wasn't short, so we kind of blended, you know.
Yeah.
And we had the play, the operetta. It was really beautiful.
Fantastic success.
It was really beautiful. And we had it several times, and it was so good that they invited us to go and have it at Town Hall.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
And we were written up in the paper. And from that time on, For every class I went to, they said, "That's Peggy. That's Peggy.
You're
Oh,
famous.
that's Peggy." And all through public school, this is the way I went. And everybody knew me in the neighborhood. And I mean, I was like, shy. I wasn't pushy,
Right.
and I couldn't understand why some of the kids always would say mean things about me. And my mother said, "They're only jealous of you,
Like
Rose.
one of the mean things was
Don't worry."
they'd look up at her, they'd say, "How's the weather?"
No,
up there?"
that was in high school. No, like we had a slam book. You know what a slam book is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where you write something
You
and they-
fold it up.
and some of them would say, "She's a show-off," which I wasn't. I was so not a show-off. And because of that, I became even more introverted because I didn't want people
to
to
think you were a show.
look at me and think things
Snobby.
about me. But that's the way I grew up. I was really the star of the show.
Get to high school.
That's
Yeah.
right. And then what high school did you go
I
to?
went to Franklin K. Lane because I didn't want to do Hebrew. My father spoke Spanish from Mexico, so I wanted to learn Spanish. And if you went to Jefferson, you were forced to take Hebrew at the time.
Okay.
So there weren't too many Jewish kids there.
Okay.
They're mostly from Jamaica. But I liked it. It was very nice. And my things that, excuse me, the things I remember were there were two people from Dramatic Club, and they became famous later on. Only one was a black fellow named Earl Hyman. He was in many things, but one of the things he was in was with Bill Cosby's show. I think
Oh, wow.
he was something in
Move
that.
on.
And then there was somebody named Ann Jackson, and she
Ann.
married Eli Wallach, and she was an actress. But when we were in school and we were trying out for the play, I got the part over Ann Jackson. So that was my claim to fame. High school was nice. It wasn't like public school where, people didn't know me.
Yeah.
But it was a lovely school at the time. It was very nice.
Go to college.
And then after that, you had to take a test to get in because there was free school, free college. And I went to.
It was totally free?
Hmm?
It was totally free to go to college? You didn't have to pay anything?
Not to Brooklyn, no.
Wow, that's impressive.
It was very tough getting in.
At that time, not everybody went.
I see.
I had my best friend in public school, well, besides my friend Freya, who just passed away, but my best friend was Dorothy Sagaby. I was very tall, but I was never the tallest in the class because she was always taller than me.
Oh,
And she was a Gentile girl who lived on Fountain Avenue, and she had a very sad life because she died at 17.
oh no.
And in those days,
At
her body was laid out at home.
Wake.
And her wake, whatever. And I went there with another friend and her mother, who knew that I was her best friend.
Graduation.
And
time.
it was graduation time. And she looked at me and she said, she'll graduate in heaven,
Oh,
which
And that struck me.
never left me.
yeah.
And, but she went to girls' commercial.
Okay.
There were courses. You either took a general, which was academic, or your commercial, which was we would be a secretary.
Got it.
I never, I wanted to go to college. So I went to college, and we had. I didn't join a sorority, but it was like what I belonged to.
Light Upper Hill.
No, oh, that was.
You don't remember.
Oh, in high school.
No, this is Colin.
College.
Wait a minute. But what was it called? It was like a social group
Okay.
we had, but it wasn't as expensive
Mhm.
as belonging to a sorority. And the week before I was going to be 19, we went to some dance or other, and I met someone, and we clicked.
I
And
wasn't there.
we clicked
What
so
is
much
that?
that we became engaged. And then I just, for whatever reason,
Simple.
didn't want to go through with it. And I was going through agony because I didn't know how to do this. I mean, he was ready, you know, like looking for a job and set the date. We had an engagement party.
Oh my God.
And I just, one night, I said, I'm sorry, Jack. It was awful. I can't even tell you how awful it was.
Yeah.
I was
You just
crying. It was
demonstrated how
terrible.
awful it was.
And the next morning, I went just back to school, to college. I was in Brooklyn College. And I belonged to Light Opera Guild. And they were having tryouts for an operetta called The Beggar's Opera. And the next morning, in my sadness, I went to try out. Daddy. That's,
Really?
there was somebody there named Bern COVID, and he tried out and he got the part to make the lead.
And then
I
you
got
were
the
born.
second lead. I was not the good one that he married. I was the bad one.
Her name in the show was Lucy Lockett because she was the daughter,
The daughter of the prison
of the
guard,
jailer. the guy
Got it.
whose name was Lockett.
And then what was your major?
My major was Spanish.
Okay.
But
Wow.
my minor was English, speech.
Right. Okay.
And dramatic.
Then I realized I am not, well, that was later on.
And she got a degree in Spanish.
Yeah, in Spanish.
Then,
You have a degree in Spanish?
yeah,
Well, I majored in Spanish. And then
I knew that.
I didn't know.
I decided, I changed, and I decided to go back after working in this place, a few places. One was called Export Finders Bureau, and I decided it wasn't for me.
move on.
And I really wanted to do my speech.
So you're back to Brooklyn.
So I was minoring in speech. I mean, I had taken a lot, but so I went back and I took some more courses, and we finished at the same time.
So did you have, but did you go and get a degree, a master's degree in education or in speech pathology?
Well, when I graduated and came back and got another degree or finished up with speech pathology, by that time, Daddy and I had met and decided that we wanted to be married. So there was the University of Iowa, which was considered the best
school in
speech pathology. And it was also
the
a
best
wonderful school.
the
in
creative
what Daddy
writers
was going
workshop
to
is
do.
world renowned.
So we decided that that's what we would do. And I got a master's in speech pathology and audiology.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think both of those programs are still like
Thriving.
thriving at Iowa, which
Right.
is just.
There was a very famous man called Wendell Johnson in Iowa. He was head of the speech department, and he was known as a stutterer who was able to
Cure
control and help himself improve. And at that time, it was like the big thing. There weren't that many speech pathologists. And so Daddy and I went there, and we left the wedding. We had our wedding, which was beautiful.
Before.
And from the wedding, we left on the train and spent our honeymoon
Honeymoon was on the train.
on the train
That's fun.
going to Iowa City. And before that, we were wondering, you know, it was still time, like after the war time, and things were not settled. And my father
Met.
had, in his shop where he worked, was telling someone that his daughter is going to Iowa City. And the man said, oh, you know, I know someone in that place. I know a family. Why don't you write to this family? Maybe they could help you find a place to live. because it was very difficult for us to find a place to live in the college vicinity. We did, and we got a letter back from this family. They were called the Braverman
Can't
family.
wait to see.
And they said, we don't know where you could stay, but you could certainly stay with us until you become acclimated and find a place for yourself.
Settle down.
Very good.
So
So good.
what we did was
Train
get on the
station.
train and stopped at Chicago, changed trains, and took a train to Iowa City. And it was cold, windy winter.
Blizzard.
Get up. It wasn't a blizzard. It was like cold.
There were
very
3
cold.
feet of snow on the
Yes,
platform.
but we
Not a
weren't in the
blizzard.
blizzard. And we get off the train, and I'm looking around. There's nobody there, and we see this woman holding the hand of a little girl, and she comes over to me, and she said, "Mrs. COVID?" And I looked around for my mother-in-law. It's the first
Never
time.
forget.
And
That's funny.
Mrs. COVID. It was Rosalie Braverman.
And that was the start of a,
And she brought us to her home.
they took us
They
into
had a
their
very lovely house in Iowa City,
family
and we suddenly became part of their family. It was
That's
a
great.
until we
magnificent
found our own apartment
experience.
in another place.
The Bravermans owned a supermarket
Yeah,
called
so
the
there was
Big
no
D.
lack of eating.
That's good.
They had 4 children, and we were there. And then eventually we found a place to live, but we never lost touch. We were always invited to Sunday dinners, and it was just the most beautiful experience with them.
That's nice.
And then there was one other person. Her name was Bee Stanger from Brooklyn College. She came to Iowa too.
Bees.
Well, no, her name was Beatrice Reisman. She wasn't.
I know, it's just funny. Her name is Bee Stanger.
I never thought of that.
Go ahead.
How did you get that name if that wasn't her real name?
Bee Reisman.
All
Beatrice
right,
Reisman.
move on.
And she and I were both majoring in speech pathology. And we
And
became
audiology.
very good friends. Very good. And all 3 of us were like pals. But she was single, we were married. So it was not that easy for me because everyone else there was single. I was the only married person, so I wasn't always involved with all the things they did.
Right.
But we became the Bravermans family.
Pet.
Very good.
Um,
Well, we have other questions here.
At this point in time, who were your favorite like singers? What were your favorite movies?
Actors.
Oh, yes. When I was a little girl, when we were young, we collected actors and actresses. That's what we called it. And we would always buy these magazines,
Movie
you know,
book.
like movie something or
Movie
famous
stars.
stars. And so my favorites were Errol Flynn, Tyrone Power. There was an actress called Anita Louise, who I thought was beautiful, and Olivia de Havilland. I didn't love Betty Davis so much.
Squeeze likes Olivia de Havilland.
And you know, all the wonderful actresses of the 30s and 40s were the ones that I loved.
And the movies.
And my friends, I had a group of friends. Freya was my best friend. She lived across the street, and she loved me. She always told me, I mean, when she died a few months ago, it was like I
Lost my best friend.
Yeah.
She knew everything about me. There was nobody else left in my family because my brother was younger and he was gone. And she knew my parents. She knew everything. And she was not a mean person. She just loved me, you know?
Yeah.
So we had a group of friends, and when we come home from school every day, I'd meet my mother. We'd go to the candy store, and she'd say, okay, what do you want? And I would either have ice cream, I would have a butter pecan come with sprinkles, or they had something called Charlotte Russe at the time, which was like sponge cake with whipped cream that people pushed out of a cardboard thing.
Mhm.
There were candy stores. We didn't have phones at the time. If we needed telephone calls, we'd have to be called at the candy store, and they'd run over to the house and say, "You have a telephone call." And we'd run out, answer the phone. I mean, before we got a phone. And and my mother loved what we called malteds. They're milkshakes. And she always used to love malteds.
With a pretzel in it?
And we'd get malteds with those either long salty pretzels, or those are the things we did.
Okay.
And then we put our books in or whatever, and they'd say, "Okay, call for me. Call for me. I'll call for you. I'll call for you." And we had like 5 or 6 girls, and we'd just roam around and stay together and tell stories and have the best time.
I wasn't
Or
there.
else we'd play stoop ball. Do you know what stoop ball?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Or we'd play handball or potsy,
How about jump rope?
jump rope. You know, we would do all these things that people, nobody does now.
I know. Well,
They do other
It was
things.
lovely.
They go
It was just
protesting, they burn
wonderful.
down buildings. They,
No,
you
no,
know,
but it was just a lovely growing up. It was not mean. It was not,
No.
it was just beautiful.
Mhm.
and Daddad, who are your actors and singers and movie stars? Those things that you
I
like?
can't hear you, sweetie.
The entertainers that you liked the most, like
Singers
yeah.
and actors in movies.
Oh. I like movies in general. And what can I say? Love movies, still do.
Oh, every Saturday, I can tell you a story. Oh, every Saturday afternoon, because my father worked on Saturday, my mother and I and a friend or my brother or someone would go to the movies. It was called the Cinema, only we called it the Kinema. We stop at the deli and we get lunch. I'd order like hot dog with sauerkraut and what else? Mustard. Oh, it was wonderful. And then my mother never let me go by myself. So she took us and we'd go and we'd see 2 features and then things in between the features, like a Dick Tracy serial, which left you like from week to week. And we saw wonderful films. That was my Saturday. Then we'd come home and we'd have bagels and lox.
Oh, that's
What a day.
Yes. Okay, so I want to give everyone I have to go to the bathroom. So if anyone else wants to go to
Do an intermission?
or like minute intermission. Are you like, do you want to take a break just for 2 minutes, or Breezy? Because I want to make sure that you're not getting too tuckered out. I can go to the bathroom and Breezy can. Breezy, just go.
Can we ask Breezy question?
Wait, ask these questions in
You
tandem.
need to know Breezy's history.
Well, I'll just be right back.
No,
Hold on. I'll be right back.
I'm going to the bathroom out.
Okay.
Okay, so intermission for
Yeah,
2 minutes.
an intermission.
Here's Liv for.
Are you getting tired at all?
How long? No, but how long are we doing this?
2 minutes. Well, it's just 2 minutes.
Oh,
Till,
Okay.
I let these.
Okay. So this is during the intermission.
Hi, Lip.
I live.
if you think that if you get tired, we can do part 2 another day.
Oh,
Oh, we'll definitely do part 2.
I didn't finish part 1 yet.
No, we'll finish.
Because we're still, at the beginning, essentially. I guess we're halfway through, sort of. Are you having a good time? Do you like it?
Well, we were always supposed to do that. We were supposed to do it with my aunt. And she got too beyond the point.
You're supposed to do something like this?
Yeah, I wanted Paul to do it,
Oh, okay.
but he didn't do it. And I was so sad that my mother died too young for me to get all this information.
Mm-hmm.
But I could tell you that we were an extremely close family. So every Sunday we would gather at my grandparents' home
Mm-hmm.
and everybody would come. and Auntie Anna would come from where she lived in Brooklyn. And, you know, by that time there were grandchildren. And we
And
did.
people used to come from the neighborhood
And
outside the window.
oh, that was when my mother and her sister were young, and Auntie Anna was an opera star. My mother played the piano. That was one of her talents. And she would accompany Anna, and they would practice the music, and everybody on the street would come
Well,
and listen.
that's so nice.
You were on the first floor.
Oh, no, the house, they lived in a house. And when my brother and my mother never really went away and left us when we were young. There was always someone to watch us, but sometimes she would have to go with people, her family, and we were not able to go. We were too young. So we had this lady who lived there. Her name was Mrs. Peskoff. She was literally small and
Big.
Oh,
It's
big.
like,
and she smelled.
oh no,
She had an odor.
oh no.
We thought, and she came and she would babysit us, and Maurice and I would
No, our babies are stunk.
Oh no, oh no, that's not good.
Oh, no. Okay, so hold on. Okay, so I'm going to amend some of this to combine them. Okay, so the next question is the following as far as identity pieces. How had the following shaped your identity growing up during the Great Depression, being raised by parents who are immigrants, and being Jewish in the United States? From, you know, just
Answer however you will.
yeah, but like in general, you don't have to limit it to just this was the one moment. It could just be broad. How has growing up in the Great Depression shaped you? How has being raised by immigrants shaped you? And how has being Jewish in the United States shaped
We really weren't even, I wasn't aware of the Depression.
you? Okay.
But my father never lost a job. He always worked. He earned a magnificent salary of about $21 a week. And I remember very vividly, he would bring home a paycheck, immediately give my mother the whole paycheck, and she would figure out the money for the week and give him the empty envelope. So
Wow.
that was, I lived a pretty happy life, had a fair amount of friends, not too many, but good friends who used to play ball a lot in the backyard of this apartment house. And during the winter, we'd have all kinds of winter sports like snowball fights and forts and stuff like that. And I guess I began to notice girls about that time and in the building that we lived in. So, it was that kind of thing. We enjoyed life, had a lot of fun. Even at one point, we got the extent of forming a softball team of the people mainly on the block or nearby neighborhood. And we called ourselves the Cheyennes, Indian, the famous Northern Plains Indians, and played softball and bought ourselves lovely jackets, zip-up jackets with our names on there. Beautiful. And it was interesting. We would have meetings every week and things like that.
Grandmother.
um,
Do you want to hear the questions again?
how did being living
So,
during
follow-
the Depression?
How did the following, shape your identity? Being raised during the Great Depression, having parents who are immigrants, and being Jewish in the United States.
Well, I never had the feeling that I was deprived of anything because my mother gave me dancing lessons when I was 3. I took dramatic lessons. They weren't called dramatic lessons, they were called elocution lessons. And I was always, everything was focused on me. And my grandparents had a house. They weren't you know, nobody was like living in poor circumstances.
Mhm.
My grandfather and his sons had this business called the coat front business,
Canvas
what they-
linings.
which was canvas linings for men's
It's called a coat front.
jackets. And they had what they called the shop. And the shop was on 14th Street, right across the street from Bloomingdale's
In
and
Manhattan.
not Bloomingdale's, Orbach's and Klein's, which were very, very, very big stores at the time.
Busy store.
And so they worked, you know, they weren't out of work. And my father, when he sold his cleaning store, which was a big mistake, it was just before the war, because during the war, people who had a cleaning store
Made out of like.
that did very well, but you know, people don't always do that. So the thing is, he had to find a different job. And for a while, I guess that was a little touchy, but he always found a job because he was so good at what he did. But of course, my Aunt Anna, her husband worked with the coat fronts, and he was a different,
Factory.
no, he worked for my uncles, and then he branched out on his own, and she became richer, what they call richer. She moved
They were rich. They were wealthy.
she moved to Kings Highway in Flatbush. We still lived in East New York. East New York was not an expensive area. And there were mostly Jews, but there were also Italians,
There was
Greeks.
behind their house was farmland. There'd be goats on it.
That was in
The next door neighbor was an Italian person who grew great tomatoes in his front and side yard.
yeah, it was
A rural.
but it was not
not
up and
fancy.
coming type of place. But it was such a wonderful place because the school was marvelous, and all my friends were Jewish except Dorothy, who I loved.
Right.
So I never had the feeling of, but I knew there were Italians because I saw their Christmas trees, and I would love
Slept over.
looking into their windows and seeing those trees glistening. And every Easter, they would all get new clothes, what we called spring coats and hats. So they had certain ways, and of course they went to church. So we knew that, but it wasn't, and there was one black child in my kindergarten, and there was one black teacher. Her name was Mrs. Simpkins. I think she was the kindergarten teacher. And he was just a lovely kid. We didn't know about anything that would cause us a friction or tension.
Okay.
But my mother was always wanting more because she saw her sister, Anna, had more beautiful clothes, more beautiful
Okay, when-
ways of living. And I guess she resented my father in a sense for not being as gung-ho in business
aggressive.
because he worked for someone and didn't have his own business, which Al, her sister's husband, was very good at doing that. Knew how to make acquaintances and connections and so forth.
I see.
But it's funny, when I went on a trip years later with Lynn and Maurice, my brother Maurice, my brother always, whatever, he became very wealthy. And when we talked about our childhood, she said, Maurice always felt that you were poor. I said, how could you say that? We were never poor.
Compared to
We
what?
lived in well, we shared a bedroom, Maurice and I, but that we had they called 4 rooms, 2 bedrooms. A lot of people lived in only an apartment with 1 bedroom
With a
and had
folding
to really
couch.
share more differently. And she said, oh, Maurice said that your mother was, so he was 5 years younger and he saw the world completely differently.
Right.
One thing Maurice loved to do was play with pennies. He would lie on the bed
I saw that.
and he'd have like the quilt
armies of
and
pennies,
he put pennies,
counting pennies.
and these would be, he'd play with his pennies. I guess money was always very important to him.
Interesting.
I didn't worry about it. I had everything. My mother bought me the best clothes. She took me to Pitkin Avenue where they had the nicest shops. I mean, I was really coddled as a child.
That's good. Okay, so, oh
What
wait,
did
Daddad,
your
are you
child
showing?
look like when we were married?
Oh, that's your wedding
Oh,
pic.
that's such a nice story.
Raise it up a little more.
Higher, higher, higher.
Up there you go. Oh, very nice.
That's a nice picture.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Grandmother's dress is so nice.
Up more.
There
Very
you go.
good.
How about that gown?
I know, it's perfect. A little lower. Very good.
My
Okay,
grandparents were very instrumental in my life. My mother did everything for my grandmother. She was a marvelous daughter,
period.
and we would be there all the time. And my grandfather he wanted me to sing, you know, all the Jewish songs, and they were very musical. I came from a musical family. My
Grandfather
grandfather
played.
could plunk out every tune without knowing notes. Anna had a magnificent voice. All the boys, we were musical.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I grew up singing and dancing and acting, and it was just great.
Very nice. Okay, so the next questions, so now we're segueing
We're segueing
into the war.
Yeah.
So these questions are, what was for you life like in the United States on the onset of World War II, both before the United States entered the war and then after? Like, what changes did you notice? What was it like on the ground? And then,
During the war?
yeah, like
On the onset.
on the onset. So thinking about it in two different ways. The World War II breaks out. What was life like in the United States? And then Pearl Harbor happens. What was life like in the United States?
Well, I'll tell you sad stories. My father's whole family, or many of his family, were in Europe. He had one brother who I think was his real full brother, because he had other sisters and brothers that were half.
Half brother.
And when the war broke out, or before, not our war, but the European war,
Mhm.
and Jews started to be persecuted, my father's brother, they wanted to send his daughter, who was a year or two younger than me, to the United States. And my mother said, we don't have room. And we had no place to put her.
What year was that? Do you remember?
It was probably in the 30s. And
39 or
I don't know exactly what year, but she never came.
Mm-hmm.
And then my father's brother, they both disappeared. We never found out what happened. I think maybe my father knew, or maybe he went to Russia, something like that. My father was basically a communist when he was in this country.
Right.
You know, he really liked Russia.
Communist.
And he read newspapers in Yiddish, which were more socialist communist.
Right.
But she never came. And
That's hard.
we lost track. And to my dying day, I feel guilt that we never brought her here and that we never figured out. We had one piece of paper that said my father's,
Fragment of an envelope.
my uncle's, his brother's address. We lost it. I don't know where
But
it
he
is.
had moved on.
But they were gone. They were probably murdered or something.
Right. It's hard to, yeah.
They were gone. And so other families brought relatives from Europe, but we didn't. So that was not good.
Beyond that one story, in your experience, the way things were.
When the war started, I remember Pearl Harbor Day.
Right.
Parents had gone to see a Jewish show. They were not home. I was doing homework. I was 14. I was doing homework and Maurice was in the house. And all of a sudden on the radio, we heard that this happened. So I know exactly what I was doing at the time. That's how it,
Right.
but as far as knowing people in my family who went to war, I didn't know because my Uncle Mo was married. They were not the right age. My Uncle Sam, I think, did go later on for a very short time, but he didn't stay there. So we personally had no horrible things happen to us. I didn't go out with boys at that time, so, you know, everyone, yeah, maybe I wrote some letters to some guys, but it was not anything that touched me personally.
Got it.
It might have touched my father, but he didn't communicate these things with us. I didn't know, you know, and I only known, but I all these are regrets. But then when the war ended, I was older, we had what we called block parties. It was the most happy time. All the streets would have music. We'd dance in the streets, in the gutters. They called them gutters. And I first learned how to drink beer. I never drank beer in my life. And, you know, and that's when I, you know, started seeing guys and stuff like that. But
That's you.
so I remember the block parties. I remember that some people had sadness or they had relatives. I personally did not. We were very lucky that way.
Yeah, very lucky.
Mm-hmm.
And Daddad, obviously you were in the Army, but before entering the Army, what are your memories of just World War II starting in Europe and then also like the, you know,
Well,
hearing about.
I remember I was aware of the things that were going on in the murder of Jews at different concentration camps, although there wasn't that too much specific information about what was really going on.
So hold on, I want to backtrack specifically. So this is for both Daddad and grandmother, because another question we have is, how did you learn about Jews being murdered? Was it that people were telling you that in your family, or were you reading a newspaper? Like, what was your earliest memory of finding that out?
It would be pretty much the newspaper, and some of the commentators on the radio would indicate they had heard, you know, things were going on. It's hard to keep that
We heard
secret.
about that ship that came and Roosevelt
The
sent
St.
it away.
Louis, it was called.
Right, the St. Louis.
Refugees.
But the point is, we loved Roosevelt. He was like an idol.
Yeah.
And so we didn't think badly of him. It's just in later years when I thought about it, you know, when people started to say, why did Roosevelt do that? Because people hated Jews. And, you know,
That was the time.
we didn't know it at the time. But there was a lot of anti-Semitism.
Okay.
Right, but I wanted to, you know, the reason is to get your perspective and you're right, to not really hear it from this, now we have historical relevance, you know, but just your experience in the 30s, you know, and for Daddad, what was it like for you before entering?
I was a teenager, what was I, about 14 or 15 and 16 growing up, and I was aware of it and very much disappointed by what was going on, and angry too about what was being done to the Jewish people. But I had other things going on. I was in, you know, that post-puberty period. I was playing a lot of tennis and doing things I like. And from my parents, I could do nothing wrong. To my mother, I could do nothing wrong. My father, as long as I did well, and we never interacted on how I was doing, but he saw if I was doing well in the Hebrew school, he was delighted, I'm sure.
Oh, my father wanted me to go to learn Yiddish, to write it and read it. And he sent me a couple of times to a Jewish school, which I had to do after school at night or something like that. I was so involved with my school, which was like the hub of my existence, that I didn't want to do it. So I never learned how to write, but I knew how to speak Yiddish. I knew how to understand it from my grandparents, but I didn't know how to read it or write it.
Right, that's different. Okay, so the next few questions are just for Daddad, because it's just about the Army.
Mhm.
Okay, so Daddad, what was your title in the Army?
Well, first, what was it when you
I was
found
a
out?
private when I came in 1943 in April, and went through basic training in the United States.
Where in the
Yeah,
United
where in
States?
the United States?
Hmm?
Where in the United States?
Yeah, where was the basic training?
Well, we were inducted into Fort. All right, I'm losing it. Anyway, basic training had something called maneuvers after about 6 or 8 weeks of training in how to hold a weapon or fire guns and military performance and characteristics. They had maneuvers which were very realistic with real weapons and cannon and tanks and groups of marching men, maneuvering. And the maneuvers were extensive over Tennessee completely, between Nashville, Knoxville, and parts of Tennessee. They were called so realistic that later on they were called even more realistic than the actual war in Europe.
Wow.
And I became proficient in a unit that was involved in forward observation. It was called an observation battalion, which got information for firing heavy artillery guns. But they would go through the atmosphere, and the unit that I eventually led, one of the leaders, was involved in getting the information on weather conditions or conditions aloft, like wind direction, force, and what the humidity was locally. All this affected how they aimed the major large cannons, not the smaller cannons that were used by the infantry and that kind of thing. But they were used by these cannons that fired a long distance, and some went up into the substratosphere in order to get that trajectory and reach that distance.
Right.
So it was called a meteorology section. And so the unit was called a field artillery observation battalion.
Okay.
Where did you travel to?
Say again?
Well, we mean,
Like,
as far as your time before you went to Europe in the United States, do you remember traveling from different places, or was it just in Tennessee that you were in that area for
Well,
training?
basically in Tennessee.
And then you went to Europe.
And then we were left to go overseas after a while.
So what
training.
was,
And
right,
at that
so-
point, I'd gone from private to tech sergeant, which is 5 stripes. I had just made a note the other day to myself, what was the salaries like? I went in as a private at $50 a month.
wow,
By the tech sergeant, I was about $170 a month, plus some other things like cartons of cigarettes and some liquor once I got that point. And when I left to go overseas, my papers came through after a voyage overseas on the Queen Elizabeth. It was a big liner converted to a troop ship, which carried between 15 and 17,000 soldiers on it. In fact, it was so big and so many people on board. We had different areas that we could go into, and therefore I had a yellow card, green card, blue card, or white card, and you couldn't go into the other area unless there was a very strong reason for you to do so, because it would unbalance the ship a little bit, would you believe? Hard to believe.
Yeah.
And anyway, a lot of us spent a lot of time up on deck where we would have access to boxes of chocolate bars and things like that. But just then I became a second lieutenant, and occupied a room on the ship, which was set up for infantry or a non-commissioned officers in a tier of 6 beds in that. So 6 of us do a room.
That's a
But when
lot.
I made second lieutenant, I went into one where there was only one other person in the thing. And the voyage overseas was kind of uneventful, but the liner made big diversions, 500 miles one way, 500 another way, to avoid submarines. But we got there okay.
Where
Reached a
did you
place-
arrive?
Landed in Scotland. When did I arrive? When was that? Well, it would be in early 1944.
Okay.
And we landed in a place called Greenock, Scotland. And in my particular unit, got on a train and went all the way down south to the south of England.
Laundry? Okay.
Good. Down to this place called Bournemouth in southern, it's on a beachfront or waterfront area. And from there we waited, we kept on training every day, go 5-mile hikes with full pack and all that kind of stuff. And after a while, along came D-Day finally after a long wait. And our unit, you couldn't all go at one time. The main people who went first were infantry and armored groups like tanks and things like that. They would go with landing craft that would let people off near the shore enough to be able to wade up the beach and into Normandy, which was where we landed. And that was a very exciting time. And there was some German airplanes used to come over and bomb the beach trying to stop what was going on, but to no avail. I mean, they killed a few people, but it wasn't able to stop us. And then began the move through France, into northern France, and then into Alsace-Lorraine, and were finally confronted by the Maginot Line, which was supposed to be a French fortification meant to hold off German invasions. And the guns wouldn't turn around, but the Germans had fortifications in that Maginot Line. The forts were so tremendously and so strong and big and involved that heavy artillery shells would land on the fort, the visible fort above the ground, and bounce off, just knock off maybe a couple of pieces of concrete. They weren't able to knock out these very strong fortifications. But eventually we did by such things as bombing them with dropping cans of oil, and there has to be an opening for air and things like that. Eventually got into there and then firebombed, and that broke up a lot of the forts. So eventually the forts were overcome, and we moved on and eventually came to the Rhine and crossed the Rhine, there were a lot of stuff going on in between. But so we were like, there was the infantry, there was an armored division ahead of us, and we were in a trail of different units going. And I went through Germany in what was called a weapons carrier, which is like a small truck for carrying 2 people in front and about 6 people or equipment would be in the back. And our equipment was meteorological equipment and other things, because the battalion, the whole group, were involved also. They would find enemy locations by sound of their gunfire, big guns, by sound of the cannon, or by the flash of the cannon when it went off, enemy cannon.
Right.
And so we had to collate all of that information, plus the weather information, which was taken by sending up, at the first, it would be like a balloon with a lighted lantern underneath going up, and you tracked it on an instrument that looked like a theodolite on tripods. And this was usually out in open ground, and you were exposed, and it was a little hairy at the time. But we went through while we were in France, we went through the hedgerows, and in one place, one of the enemy shells landed near a truck, one of our trucks, and killed the driver. Very severely wounded the driver. And who was a nice Italian fellow, and I used to go visit him a couple of times. When after the war, he was he was sent back and was in one of the hospitals up in the Bronx, would you believe?
Oh, wow.
Anyway, all kinds of great, but here I was, a young kid, about 19 or so, and it was all a sort of an excitement,
Right.
and give you a strange feeling, like I was driving in the truck, and I'd be whistling the Valkyria tune, or Lafayette, here we come again, you know, and it was all kinds of that stuff, but very interesting, occasionally very frightening, but most of the time exciting type of thing.
Do you remember it being particularly notable that you were a Jewish person? Do you remember it being particularly notable that you were a Jewish person in the Army? Were there other Jewish people?
You're talking about after the war?
No, during that you were.
Yeah.
Were there
Yes,
other Jewish
a few
people in the Army
confrontations
with you?
where the unit I came with had a lot of non-Jews, especially the people called the cadre, the basic people that new recruits would join, and they would they would train you and form you into a unit that does whatever functions you have. They were mainly non-Jewish, and we, coming from the New York area, a lot of fairly large number of Jews were in our outfit, and I made good friends there. But the leader of one of the, I had problems because of I thought it was a Jewish problem, and one time I actually went in and spoke to the superior officers about discrimination, and I felt that being held back from being promoted. And, you know, but there were non-Jews I was very friendly with. My best friend was the doctor, Captain Taylor, who was very, very, I got along very, very well. And the war had its frightening moments. There were times, eventually, like in the Battle of the Bulge, and I was with General Patton's Third Army, an army of like 15,000 people, who divided into infantry, artillery, tank corps, and things of that, and other support operation. It was very exciting with Patton, whom I did actually have a little to do with on a couple of occasions, which were very interesting. So it was exciting, and he was a winner. He went through, and he would fight little battles and move on and move. You know, it was a lot of motion. So we went through Germany in a fairly rapid way, and of course, stopping occasionally in a German town. The townspeople would come out with white flags or surrendering, and we're not Nazis. We're not, we're good people. And so, in a sense, I made some contact with German families, but you weren't supposed to fraternize with the Germans too much, which I didn't do.
Okay.
What else can I tell you?
But when we were at Yad Vashem, when we were all at Yad Vashem, you had mentioned that you were at a concentration camp liberating the camp.
Oh yeah, we came to this one concentration camp in the middle of a forest, and the Germans were going out the back area as we were doing it. And we were with this outfit called the 4th Armored Division, which actually captured that thing, and we were right there behind them, and went on into the camp itself. And they liberated the barracks where there would be male prisoners, and then there was one for women prisoners and others. And that was a very, very emotional moment, because out of these barracks stumbled people who were like walking skeletons, dressed in those stripes, just like we've seen in the movies, obviously. And also out stumbled Jews among those. And I don't know exactly how it happened, but one of them came over to me and said, and he was like ready to collapse. You're Jewish, aren't you? And I said, yes. And he like, it was amazing. He says, we Jewish too. And how we want to thank you for coming. And in the meantime, I look around and there were still two German, they actually may have been Polish people, guards of the camp left still in there that were caught when they broke in. And these walking skeletons, some of them I noticed walked toward these two guys. They finally caught up with them. They could barely walk themselves. And they got hold of them by their uniforms and they rubbed them across the barbed wire. And that was a thing I never forgot. And I understood the anguish of it. And I was so sad for these people because my friend Captain Taylor said, you're looking at people who are not going to make it. They'd already gone beyond. And I understood then what traits they were in. Plus they were Irishmen, they were British flyers, there were people of many, there were some gypsies even, and the gypsies were almost always killed immediately. But these were good Husky people originally, apparently, and were put into a work camp.
What was the name of the camp?
I don't remember.
What country was it in? What country?
In Germany.
Oh, it was in Germany. Okay. And how did they know you were Jewish when you said the survivors encountered you and they said you're Jewish, right? How did they know you were Jewish?
How did they know I was Jewish?
Yeah.
I think, I don't know, I guess there may have been some kind, I may have said something first.
In Yiddish?
Do you know any Jews? I thought these are all Jews. So the person I asked did that. And then this other, one of them may have overheard and came over and spoke a little English, which was interesting because he had an uncle in St. Louis. All of them had relatives in the USA, it seemed. And at that point, when we were finally, not this group, but when after the war ended, they put them up in German military barracks area buildings, which had a big meadow for marching up and parading up and down military barracks. And the barracks buildings were about, I guess 6 stories high. And on every level there were floors divided into single rooms, that kind of thing. And that's where they put the displaced persons, the Jews who were now displaced, they would be living there. And there is when I spoke to I knew they were Jews. We used to go, I went out after dinner one night and spoke to a couple of them, and they were very surprised that someone was Jewish.
Didn't they ask you to write a letter or something?
Well, I'm getting just at that point. And in discussion, I was so carried away, they said, are you really an observant Jew? And I said, I'm observant Jew, and my father is like a tzaddik, I call it, which means a sage or a wise man who's very observant. I was carried away. I was trying to impress him, I guess. Anyway, somebody there started to ask me, I have an uncle in Milwaukee. I don't know how close that is to New York, but where you said your father lives, but could you find a way of contacting him and telling him I'm alive? And he gives me his name and address and all that stuff. And I wrote a letter in Hebrew to my father, in Yiddish, I guess, tell him about this and giving him the name. And my father actually acted on it, contacted this person and told him about this friend, Moshe or something, who was among the living, so-called, in this camp that we liberated. And somehow the story, including my letter, I guess taken from my letter, got taken out by the Jewish newspaper, and they're printing a picture of me with this, and they said, American Jew helps out the displaced, the displaced people by contacting their relatives in the U.S. The whole
What,
thing
what news was
was almost a full page.
what,
What newspaper, yeah.
Hmm?
What newspaper?
I think it was the Forward, I believe. Forward.
Wow.
and it was published, so it was published,
Yeah, the major Yiddish paper, Forward.
and it was
It's not-
published like
there's
at
another
the
one
time?
today.
It was published at the time, like this, like how did they get like your father sent them the story or something?
Yeah, the father, and then since they had a copy of my letter, they saw what I said all about the
Wow.
detail of where this guy was. And it implied that I was doing it. I did it for several people, actually.
Right.
So they said I did that, and that kind of thing. Made me into a hero. There it
Yeah,
was.
they were highlighting you as a hero.
So anyway, what can I tell you? Okay, then things went on. The Battle of the Bulge was an exciting and terrifying and gratifying type of thing after a while, where the Germans attacked by surprise, and since they were wearing some of them wore American uniforms and carried American weapons and
Right.
drove American tanks and trucks, they penetrated the sparsely defended areas with American troops and got behind the lines and caused a lot of havoc at the time. So a lot of fear was generated by that among the units that we're involved with. But after a while, we were issued white clothing, white cover-up clothing, and therefore, it was a snowy background, so we blended in. But that wasn't one of my main stories. I think I told you about. We once stopped in a captured German town, which was largely destroyed. Any of them that put up a counteraction as tanks drove in, Patton's order was wipe them out, and that's what happened. And so towns would be obliterated practically. There was one partially bombed house at the end of town, and my particular unit was housed in that. And I remember at the time, the Army headquarters, High Command, changed the password and established a password within a way that would not allow the Germans to penetrate that way again.
Oh, yeah, I heard that
So,
story.
and they changed the password, and the password for that day was Whistling Swan. Whistling Swan. Remember, this is talking about German troops. And sure enough, that night when an forward outpost on the perimeter of the area on guard duty, saw a group of soldiers emerging from, they saw shadowy figures coming out of part of the forest and into this large snow-covered meadow that they were looking out on. And one of our soldiers said, "Halt, give us the password." And after a minute or so came a loud voice that said, "Whistling Schwan." And our people opened fire on them, and that was the end of that. And that became a big morale booster
Wow.
for our side. But that was only one detail.
My God.
But it was frightfully cold. I remember that. And one time, the bathrooms would be a trench dug outside in the snow,
Oh.
Right.
and we'd have to go outside, take off our long winter underwear, and to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
Freezing.
Yeah.
Anyway.
That's cool.
That got into my head, but it was interesting.
And then what was life like coming back from the war?
Well, because we were in the we stayed for the occupation of Germany for several months, and that has a lot of sub stories of interest. But I learned how to drive during that. Up until then, I had a driver who would drive me around in a Jeep or in a weapons carrier. And I learned how to drive a Jeep, which was manual shift.
Wow.
Just grinding the gears, but eventually learning to come off the pedal slowly and just get going. And I drove into Munich. We were stationed near Munich in this former German military barracks. And looking down from the window of my room, I could see everything going on down below, different activities going on. Anyway, I drove into Munich and drove around Munich at night. Anytime we would stop, they would see I was in uniform, and they said, "Oh, come on," you know, that kind of thing. So I was able to do that, which was against the law. First of all, I wasn't supposed to drive. Second of all, I'm not supposed to be going into Munich on a jaunt. Okay, then came finally the number. There was a number system for when you would be eligible to go back home with your unit. And just about the time we're ready to go, they figured out you had to be attached to another unit to get onto the boat. It had to be, you know, by then we were going home by individual. I wasn't going home with my unit itself. I was going home as an individual, and they had to make up, you know, sort of groups of military units on the ship. And so at that time, my papers for my lieutenantship came through, and I was assigned to a room on the ship, which had, I think, only, again, one more person. I didn't have to do any kind of duty. I just had to be living there and on the ship. And the ship took 7 days, I think, in midwinter. It was December, early December. And it took several days. And finally, we got to New York Harbor, and I saw the Statue of Liberty. And that meant the end of things, you know.
Yeah.
So
incredible. And then how?
I'm missing a lot of details.
And then so from coming back to New York to then meeting grandmother, how much time was in between?
Did you go right back to college?
Yes, I went back to college as soon as I could, and picked up on it. And in college, I again took every writing possible course. Oh, and then that was in Brooklyn College. Took every possible writing course, and the big event was meeting Mother, when we both were involved in this.
Well, that wasn't the big. We were just in the same show. We weren't involved.
Yeah, we weren't involved until later on we became involved.
Well, we started to take singing lessons together.
No, not that. I'm talking about one time we went to a party, an after-show party, and downstairs and down the steps came my ex-girlfriend, who came over, and I thought she was going to say, "Hi, how you doing?" Comes over and she bites my arm. I don't know if you remember that.
I never heard that.
No, and then she and her friend walked out. So, but that at that point, I think it reinforced my mother.
Well, you know, they need an animal.
Never happened.
Mother kisses, she doesn't bite.
Better off that, yeah, you got rid of the biter.
That's weird.
Yeah.
I never heard that story.
Okay, so the next question we have is kind of also about series of world events that were notable at the time. What was it like being in the United States in 1948 when Israel was declared?
48.
Right, in 1948, being in the United States. No, I'm saying moving forward into time of notable events, what was it like for, you know, being in the United States and knowing that Israel was declared an independent state? Was there any kind of memory that you have?
I remember in high school they talked about it.
I remember being very emotionally elated by that, and proud that, you know, that Israel finally had won its independence.
I wasn't very involved with Judaism or Israel or anything.
Mm-hmm. That's okay. Does that mean what it was like being there? But it's okay. You don't have, you know, if you just have the memory of knowing that it was happening, that's totally fine.
Yeah, I know that my social studies teacher talked about it in school. And then
Cool.
Dr. Rubinow
Cool.
talked about it.
Going back to
My father was very happy because my father was very gung-ho about Israel. much more than my mother or the rest of us.
Well, then when we graduated college, mother began, was looking for what she would be doing professionally, and I went along. So we found a job for mother. She found a job as head of a speech clinic, which was set up by the Easter Seals Foundation. And mother ran this particular clinic very successfully. And I looked around, the best I could find, I visited different schools because I had an English minor, English teacher's minor. And I visited various schools. I landed up in a rural high school in South
Carolina. South Carolina.
in South Carolina, which was quite an experience, being the only Jew and the only Northerner on the teaching staff of this rural high school. And
I got my job while I was still in college in Iowa.
Right.
I didn't go to South Carolina to interview. I just got the job, and then I went down there.
That's easy.
well, when I was looking for a job teaching, I went into one high school and the superintendent, or I believe it was the superintendent, was sitting there interviewing me. And during this interview, at some point near the end, he said, well, what is your nationality? What are you, I said, I'm Jewish. A family is born in Poland. And he says, you're Jewish. You're not one of those Catholic Jewish, aren't you? And I imagine he was looking for horns coming out.
He said that to me.
This was in a relatively modern day.
Wow.
We didn't know from Jews, and Catholics
know from
also,
Jews.
they didn't know.
But
They were
when we,
mostly Baptists.
in the town that we lived in, was a place called Hartsville, South Carolina. We, the principal of the school, of the local school, superintendent and others, they held us in such esteem that when there was a graduation ceremony, we were invited to sit up on the stage along with the other officials in the town. Oh, and
Well, it was, they used to celebrate, Roosevelt had infantile paralysis.
Right.
President Roosevelt.
Right.
And he had set up this infantile paralysis society, or whatever it was called, and people were very involved in that kind of thing. And so the people that hired me, she was the head of the Crippled Children's Society of South Carolina. And my job was to work with, I did speech therapy, but the children that I worked with were cerebral palsy children, and also other types, but mostly cerebral palsy.
And there were newspaper articles by the town put out about mother running the speech
Which
clinic.
my father made an album of.
Yeah, he made an album with had all those newspaper pictures in it.
That's awesome.
Where is that now? The album.
We have, well,
You have something?
we have
Now, I should point out that
them.
during that early period, after we managed, whenever we took a change of job, it brought us closer to New York because there was a magnetic pull to rejoin the family. So after South Carolina, we spent about a year and a half doing that, at which point I became, because they liked what I was doing so much, and I was so good for the students, they offered me a job as principal of the high school and coach of the women's softball team, baseball team. So, so that's what I was when we left there. We went back and we landed up in Baltimore, where I got a job working as a technical writer with Westinghouse Air Arm Division.
The reason that we left, the reason that I couldn't go back was because I had a miscarriage. In other words, I became pregnant.
Right.
We know what a miscarriage.
Yeah, we know what a miscarriage is.
Well, at that time, that was kind of scary because nobody in my family, I mean, my mother, she was nauseous, but nobody ever had miscarriages. I couldn't believe it. So that's why things were a little dicey. And another reason that we didn't go back to South Carolina, because I could have kept my job, you know, indefinitely.
However, in Baltimore, where we finally landed, we had family there. Yvette and her
Well,
family.
that's one of the
Yvette
reasons
and
that we
Lester.
stayed there.
And so we were there for a year or two, I guess.
But while we were in Iowa, we got this little dog,
A little dog
only it was a
who grew into a
collie.
big dog.
And
Who's a collie.
we called him Cozy. And
Her.
her. And we brought Cozy home. And when we were living in Iowa, we had this place that outside was big lawn. And when we wanted Cozy to
With
go to
our
the
own house.
bathroom, we would send
Taking him out
Cozy
on the
out
grass.
to the lawn, and Cozy would go.
Move on with the story. Move on.
And so we
Then
came
we
back.
we came to
to,
visit New
My
York.
mom, and our apartment, my father's apartment, and we brought our little baby Cozy with us.
And baby Cozy
Cozy
climbs down on the floor,
skips.
goes hip up
Hip
onto
skip.
the green
They had a
carpet,
green carpet
and
because green
Cozy-
was very popular
Cozy
in
did her
those days.
favorite thing.
My mother said,
Cozy, what did you do?
Cozy's formal name with the Kennel Club was Admiral's Lady Cosette. But we called
only
her Cozy.
little Cozy turned into Collie
Big
Cozy.
And Cozy, one had 9 puppies,
Oh,
and the next time, before we sold, we had to sell her eventually for a reason.
No, the first time she had 13, then she had 9.
First we had 13. I thought it was the other way around. Anyway, which I helped to deliver, and had 13, one of which was a runt. And we loved this little runt. Unfortunately, by nature took care of the runt, and she
Oh.
had to smother it
oh.
by,
Well, we found them on dead one day. And we
plus there
assumed
weren't enough
mother because
places where the babies could drink milk.
So sad. So sad.
Anyway, that was Cozy.
Yeah.
she was my child. At that
Yeah. I have other questions that we have on the list here. So this one's a fun one. How did Daddad propose? How did Daddad propose?
Well, I actually did the normal thing of hiding my engagement ring in a
In the room?
white bowl. Or was it fruit?
What did you hide it in?
Let Daddad do.
I think it was grapefruit bowl.
Ah,
And mother, I don't remember the details, but mother was,
at that time, people, they didn't fool around. They either, once you went together,
oh yeah.
Right. He's got married.
stopped or
In
got
fact-
married.
Fact, parentheses, one girl that I was dating felt we'd been dating so long that we took a walk, and she was saying, we've been dating so long, I think it's time we began to think seriously about getting married. And I wasn't ready to marry. So
Right. Well, okay, so what was the wedding date, you and grandmother? What's your anniversary?
February 5th,
19 what?
1950, because we graduated, we finished school,
we both graduated.
and we
from-
were on our way to Iowa, and that was the only time we had to get married before.
and we took our honeymoon on the train
Yes, we
going
talked about
overnight
that. We
before
talked about
to
that. We
Iowa.
talked about that.
So grandmother we've talked about it pretty thoroughly, that grandmother spent her career as a speech therapist. But grandmother and Daddad just talking a little bit more about your careers once you got to New York.
Yes.
What were your careers?
Well, my career was I joined or was hired by a magazine called a magazine publishing company called what was it called?
Scientific American?
No,
No, Conover, Mass.
Conover Mast was the publisher,
Mhm.
and the magazine was, when I joined, it was called Aviation Age, and I was hired as one of the associate editors. Aviation Age turned into a magazine, changed the name to reflect the growing technology of the time, to Space Slant Aeronautics. And we we were the primary monthly magazine, and a rival one, who happened to be across Midtown Manhattan from us, was called Aviation Week, which still exists and going on, doing its thing.
Yeah.
The reason that we came back to New York was because I had 2 miscarriages, and I was very upset about that, and I wasn't working at that time. And we finally discovered this. And then my mother had passed away, and that's the reason we came back to New York, because my mother had developed cancer, breast cancer, and I was living in Baltimore. In fact, I had Paul.
At the
Paul was
University
born.
Hospital.
Paul was born, which was a difficult time. My mother came, and it was October 27th he was born. And we were very happy that finally he came and everything was well. He was my 3rd pregnancy, but first-born child. And so we decided that we would have a big Thanksgiving dinner in Baltimore, that parents would come. And the next month, Paul would be, a month old. And after he was just a few weeks old, and we were getting ready for Thanksgiving, I got this call from New York that my mother was in the hospital, that she had been diagnosed with cancer and had just
Brain
had not brain cancer, she had a breast cancer, and she had to have that removed. So I took a train to the city, so my mother came back, but of course, that was the end of Thanksgiving.
Right.
That changed everything. And then when Paul was 7 months old, we decided that I couldn't just stay in Baltimore. I just needed to be near my mother. So that's the reason. That's the real reason
Plus,
that we left
I
Baltimore.
got a job.
Well, but you had a job in Baltimore. It's just
Yeah, I know.
you changed jobs.
Right.
And we came to New York. And so my mother was good for a year. And then she started having signs of cancer. But in those days, the word cancer was never mentioned. It was a taboo subject.
Never mentioned to her.
Never mentioned to people who were sick. In other words, now people are very realistic. You discuss everything, you understand everything. My mother had problems with her back. I said, oh, arthritis. Oh, your arthritis moved to this, your arthritis moved to that. Never did we ever utter the word cancer to my mother. And she was sick for a year. And she passed away, 51.
Young.
And so that kind of,
Put a damper.
up until then, I considered myself a very lucky person because no one in my family had ever been sick to that point. I mean, my grandparents were alive. Her older parents were living.
Right.
Everybody was fine, aches, pains, whatever. So that was like the first tragedy. And then a little after that, his father developed cancer, and that was the second tragedy.
Right.
And then Paul was diagnosed, or Charles was born, and in between, Maurice's baby Stephen was born, cousin Stephen, with Rita as the mother, and then Charles was born. And I was going to name Charles for my mother, Charlotte.
Right,
That's why he's called
And-
Charles.
right.
6 weeks before that, Daddad's father died. So we had to quickly give him a name for Samuel too. And so that's why he's called Charles Stewart.
Right.
But asked for that.
And that was, thank God, that was lovely. And then he was a couple of months old, Charles was 6 weeks or 8 weeks, 9 weeks, I don't know. And we saw that Paul wasn't looking very well, that something, he was
Pudgy.
like pudgy. His face was all puffed up. So when
Took
I
him
was
to the-
going to Dr. Wexler, who was my baby doctor, and we brought Charles to him too, for Charles's checkup, I said,
Look at him.
Paul was sick a week or so ago, but he got better. But look at him,
Hold on.
he seems to be very, his face is swollen. Dr. Wexler looked at him and
He's going to
said,
the hospital.
oh, he has to be immediately hospitalized. So we said, why? Well, he had something wrong with his kidneys called nephrosis, which
At
I
the
never
hospital.
heard of in my life. And so we had Paul in the hospital for several weeks.
And
And
we-
at that time, Charles was a baby,
Move on.
and I always felt that I couldn't give Charles the attention and the whatever.
That's because we had to make frequent trips to the doctor with Paul.
My life was caught up in a life and death
We were on a
situation
day-to-day basis
because the
with Paul.
kind of sickness that he had was not curable at the time. We didn't know
He
if
took,
he'd ever live.
tell about the medication.
So he
That was
did.
responsible.
They had recently discovered something called prednisone,
Right.
cortisone, prednisone,
Mhm.
and they put him on heavy doses of that, which
And he would shrink him down.
helped him, and he got better. But we had to check his urine every morning to make sure that it was a certain
And
type of color
Checking, establish what kind of day it would be.
with an algae stick. And
And
if
for him and for us.
if he went to the wrong color, then we knew that he was relapsing.
And he had to
And the
go
minute the prednisone would help him for a few weeks, and then
stop again.
he'd go.
While he was on prednisone, Paul did his best work, which was
Well,
great
he was
at
an infant. He
school.
was young then, but
We're talking about that.
no, we're talking about 3 years old, and
Yeah, I'm
he
beyond that.
would get better, but then he would relapse again. And this is the way Charles grew up. It's not just Paul.
Right.
I'm saying that your daddy,
Yeah.
I did my best, but it was a very terrible time for us. We went through a time of deafness, illness.
Yeah.
It was beyond our beliefs, you know. We didn't know what hit us. We really had a terrible time.
I can't imagine. It's just having a little
And I
baby and then having another
Charles
kid.
resented me.
Well,
I felt his whole life he resented me because I wasn't.
Well,
I mean,
when we took Paul to the doctor, Charles was pretty much on his own with whoever was babysitting him or whatever, but he was
Right.
on his own. So I'm sure he had reason for that,
it
but
wasn't that.
it
was
wasn't
just,
that at all. He had to understand what we
he
went
was a
through.
difficult kid, Charles.
But
That's
a
so
pretty,
easy.
pretty cute, difficult kid.
He was a very beautiful child. He was actually, I think, my most beautiful.
We'll be thrilled to know that.
Said it.
No,
Remember,
when he was,
you were
when
the
he
leader.
was,
Exciting.
he had blonde, gorgeous hair.
Blue eyes.
He had the
Blue gray
only
eyes.
blue eyes. I so prayed for blue eyes, never got them.
You
My
got it.
father had blue gray eyes. My grandmother had beautiful blue eyes.
My father,
His father had grayish blue eyes. All my kids, Emily had blue eyes till she was 2, and then they changed.
well, that's normal.
And Paul had beautiful eyes, but Charles had the blue. So
Hi, Uncle Paul.
Uncle Paul has
I was
joined.
just checking to see if you were still going.
No, we're still going. We'll probably be finishing
Right.
up.
we have to
oh, we
stop.
have to stop.
Well,
All right.
We'll probably be done around like 5.
Halftime.
Okay.
Are we allowed to keep going until 5, grandmother and Daddad?
No.
I think
No. Okay. So we'll stop it now, but we have another like a few questions, and then we'll do that. We'll call you and we'll resume, like another day.
Okay.
Okay, very good.
So we'll
All right.
schedule part 2.
Okay, so I'm going to stop
Yeah.
recording.
Okay. We
Oh,
hope, did this really expand any knowledge?
everything? Yeah.